Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're watching and listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, we have a very special treat for my viewers. It'll be kind of a joint operation here with Chris Thrall from the UK. Chris Thrall is one of my favorite podcasters. Many of you know I'm a student of military history with an emphasis on intelligence, counterintelligence, special operations. Well, Chris Thrall is a real live former Royal Marine Commando, and I've read a bit about the history of the Royal Marine Commandos. And I've watched his show, and I've plugged into a number of his interviews. He's interviewed interesting people in the Special Boat Service, tornado pilots, you name it. He's had them on the show, and I've learned a lot from watching his show. So it's quite a treat to be involved in this joint interview discussion. Chris, please tell my listeners about yourself, and then I'll share a bit about myself for your listeners.
Oh, James, so thank you for a very kind introduction, and obviously for getting in contact. It's a beautiful thing about this podcast is you just get to meet wonderful people all around the world. For me as an Englishman, it's a lot of my brothers and sisters in America, which I really appreciate. So just a very quick synopsis of my story. Yes, I was a Royal Marines Commando, served in the Northern Ireland conflict, Arctic war, conducted Arctic warfare training up in the Norwegian North. I left to run what was a fairly successful business in Hong Kong, and within 6 or 7 months of running my business in Hong Kong, I was chronically addicted to crystal meth amphetamine. I was phasing in and out of clinical psychosis, which we can perhaps discuss because it's quite it's very sad experience to go through, but it's also very fascinating, James, you know. And just bizarrely, I was working as a nightclub doorman for a group called the 14K. And the 14K is one of Hong Kong's triad criminal fraternities, so triad brotherhoods. And as I say, I was solely like a doorman on their nightclub, like a kind of bouncer, just to put it in loose terms. What I mean is I was never a triad or anything like this. I was just a convenient white face that they kind of used in their operation, because obviously there's a big expat community in Hong Kong, so a lot of Westerners and this kind of thing, and it kind of paid for them to employ me. This is the basis. I hope you don't mind I plug my book.
Please.
Eating Smoke, One Man's Descent into Crystal Meth Psychosis in Hong Kong's Triad Heartland. That was my first memoir. It's not I don't do the feel sorry for me thing. I'm very proud of all my life experiences, which includes all of the drugs I've taken, all of the, you know, the mental health challenges that I've come through. I'm not for 1 minute saying I would wouldn't live my life differently had I had a different knowledge set, but I came from I'm just going to say an extremely damaging childhood, and I think your viewers know what I mean when I say that. It's not hard to, you know, picture that some of us don't have the most calm starts in life, and as such we have PTSD. So the trauma thing, it's actually referred to in social science circles as unresolved childhood trauma. That is what we then carry, well, at least as long in our lives until we get around to finding ways to sort it out. But I would just say in complete honesty, I still carry a lot of it now. I can see in my actions and my reactions and my, my thoughts and the way that my body physically reacts in certain situations that I'm really still quite affected by what happened to me when I'm young. I have never had any help from the medical community. They tried to give me antipsychotic medicine and I just threw it all in the bin. I'm not suggesting people do that. No, not at all. I'm just saying this is my story, right? Moreover, I should point out, when I came back to the UK after a year in Hong Kong, I only had a little bit of the crystal meth left. It's not something you can get in England. We could only get speed, which is amphetamine, right? It's methamphetamine, but it's not the crystal meth. The crystal meth is ridiculously strong amphetamine, right? So within about 3 days of arriving back in the UK, that gear that had run out, so those drugs had run out, and within like 24 hours, I was just, from a sanity point of view, I was completely back to normal. And I remain that way. I've had two, psychotic sounds a bit wrong, but psychosis episodes subsequently, almost like one was about 2 years later, one was a few years later, both when I was out taking party drugs. So it's quite interesting that years later, it came back to me on a party night out. So yeah, so I've never been to any groups like AA and NA, so Narcotics Anonymous. I can't stand being controlled. It's a byproduct of my angry youth. Is nobody tells me what to do, or that it's quite ironic considering I was in the military, but I react really bad when I see people trying to steal other people's freedom. And what I found in those kind of groups, when they're telling you that you're ill for life, and I'm like, you've got no right to tell me I'm ill for life. I had a learned psychological condition, which is in medical terms called addiction. Well, if you can learn a psychological condition, you can unlearn it, right? So that's what I've spent my whole adult life doing, really. I won't say it comes easily. It probably took me the best part of 30 years to... Bye, gorgeous. My little man just saying goodbye. It took me 30 years really to just, get my mind in order and get a grip on the addiction. And it's it's such a misunderstood area of life for so many reasons, not least of which, some of it is fun, James. Drinking it can be fun. It can really get over boredom factor. It's brilliant for reminiscing. Part of my sort of like adventure has taken me across 80 countries on all 7 of these continents. So obviously I've had some great experiences along the way. I'm probably one of the few people, in fact, I'll be honest, I'm probably the only person I've ever met that I've achieved all of my goals and dreams, all of them, right? The last part of my dreams just walked in the door there and said, "I love you, Daddy." I'm so lucky, James. I've never taken no for an answer. I've just gone out and done what I wanted to do in life. And all of this traveling across 80 countries I've done while being to some kind of extent in the grip of addiction or living out the addictive lifestyle, right? I'm the sort of guy, I don't really say no. If you put something in front of me and say, want some of that, I'll be like, ah, go on then. You know, I like the unknown. It hasn't always been plain sailing. I hit such a low before I finally, I guess you could say, woke up to what I was doing to my body and my mind and my living standards, which had disintegrated to the point where I was basically living in squalor. But again, as I say, you won't hear me complain about anything. I took LSD with a friend of mine. We went to Portugal for a big music festival. I was never a big fan of LSD, but my friend came over and said, I've just got some liquid acid. Do you want some? Again, I'm like, okay, go on then, right? Anyway, by the end of that night, my friend had drowned in the lake, having completely gone psychotic. He's psychotic all night. It was a very tragic experience. It's not one you're going to hear me like talking sad about or bad about or negatively. It's just life, you know. For his family, obviously, it was bloody awful, absolutely awful to hear that news and to have to live with that. But I'm saying from my perspective, you know, if you get out there and you mix it up, whether it's skydiving, which I've done, whether it's going into combat, which I've done, whether it's throwing, whether it's flying aeroplanes in a storm in Florida, which as a pilot I've done. You know, there's an element of risk, and you calculate that risk, and you calculate what is it going to get me up here, and what skills for life, and what experiences am I going to carry with me, and how is it going to benefit me. So as I say, like, there's just no negatives in my life. I don't think it helps in any way to carry negatives, to look at things as negative, to say that there's good and bad, although, you know, I'm saying this quite loosely, James. So yeah, that's me. Off the back of, you know, addiction, I've gone on, as I say, to travel the whole world, all 7 continents. I've explored some of Antarctica. I've been in the Antarctic Polar Circle scuba diving. I've written, I think, 6 books now. I've got one coming out at the moment. One of which was dare I say, an international bestseller. I have worked with street children in Mozambique as a volunteer, so giving my services for free. I've done the same driving journalists from Norway, which is in Scandinavia, to India and back, so that we could write articles of people about people living in poverty. As you know, I've started a YouTube channel, which has just become so ridiculously successful beyond, I wouldn't say beyond what I can imagine, because I can imagine quite a lot, but it's just a beautiful thing to meet, to have so many great subscribers that actually want to hear my kind of adventures. The podcast, I host the Bought the T-Shirt podcast. And so that's people that have bought the T-shirt or got the T-shirt, which is great, because that means I can invite anybody on that's done anything, really. It's kind of a catch-all term. And that's it. I have a set of skills, James, that I employ in life that I would implore other people to adopt. A very quick rundown. I realize I'm talking a lot, but I eat an alkaline diet. Absolutely. Right. You cannot achieve enlightenment and live in that Kundalini spirit that you hear people talk about if your body's not alkaline. Just forget about it. Right. No negatives. I smile at the morning sun and I say thank you to this beautiful universe every single day. call it Mother Nature, call it God, call it Spirit, call it a higher power, whatever. But I am so thankful that I've had this chance at life and to live on this beautiful earth, or at least the bits that man is not destroying are beautiful, right? I always take action. So if I'm ever depressed, anxious, or my life's not going where it is, I put my running shoes on and I'll either walk around a block or I jog around a block. And that gets my mind and my body working together, and it gets you out of that stagnant depression, and it gets you onto the next phase of your life. And yeah, and one thing I guess which is relevant to our chat now, James, is my jury is always out. There's some things I feel quite certain of in this life with respect to why is it going the way it's going, and who are the individuals or powers that are shaping it that way. I've got some kind of ideas about that. But as to the, you know, the ET, Lucifer, extraterrestrial life, meaning, you know, all this kind of stuff, I'm fascinated in it, but you're not going to hear me going, right, it's like this. Over to you, mate.
Well, thank you for sharing all that, Chris. I appreciate it. A bit about myself for the benefit of your viewers and listeners. My name is James Bartley. I've been in my field of alien abduction, UFO research for over 30 years now. My mentor was Barbara Bartley, who I consider to be the dean of alien abduction researchers. She's since passed away after an assassination attempt. That's a whole nother story. She went into a coma and then she passed away. And then after her longstanding husband and dear friend of mine was also likewise, I feel, assassinated, but that's a whole nother story. One thing about alien abduction research and UFO research, when you get into the nitty gritty, it's, I would argue, if not the most highly classified, highly compartmentalized subject, it's right up there because it dovetails and intermingles with other highly classified, highly secret, compartmentalized issues, really all cut from the same cloth. And I became interested in the subject of alien abductions because I had my own alien abduction experiences. Now, a bit about my background. I'm an independent historian working on my own book, haven't put it out yet, I'm still working on it, with an emphasis on military intelligence, military history from antiquity to modern times. And that's why I found your channel, Chris, because that's what I'm into. I'm into reading about the SBS and the SAS and the German GSG-9 and all that stuff. I mean, even before it became fashionable years ago, I was really into this stuff. I was a Navy brat. That was part of the reason, because I grew up, I'm of Filipino descent, so I grew up hearing stories about my grandfather and some of my ancestors who were guerrillas in occupied Philippines when the Japanese had occupied the Philippines. My ancestors were part of those roving guerrilla bands, right?
Wow.
To about the last year of my late grandfather's life, he always received greeting cards from some Americans that he had helped. He was basically their bodyguard and their cook. They always try to stay a day or two ahead of the Japanese patrols. And my grandfather kept them alive and protected them and fed them until the submarine would show up and take them away. Well, these guys are really appreciative, and almost to the last year of my late grandfather's life, he was still getting letters from these guys, right? And my father was a Vietnam vet. He was in the he was in the Brown Water Navy, so-called, those little PBRs, patrol boats that went up and down the Mekong Delta and places like the Rung Sat Special Zone. And he'd inserted Navy SEALs and Australian SAS in a certain, he didn't go into detail, but he would just say, yeah, I was involved in some of that stuff, right? Um, and he came out of that whole Vietnam experience. He did 2 tours there. Yeah, it really definitely affected him. I mean, myriad illnesses and all these other things, but I can also tell that from an emotional, psychological feeling standpoint, my dad is a very taciturn man. He doesn't say much. He's very quiet. He doesn't say boo, really. So he just held all this stuff in all this time. And it was only a good buddy of mine who was an ex-U.S. Marine out of Camp Pendleton who befriended my dad. And then they go fishing, and the times that I wasn't out, with my buddy and with my dad, because they had that shared military background. My dad opened up and shared things with my buddy, the ex-Marine, that he didn't share with me, right? And then my buddy, the ex-Marine, tells me all this stuff, and it made my head spin. It's like, geez, he never told me all this stuff. But it was kind of like, you're an veteran. Sometimes I understand it may be difficult to convey your innermost feelings about being in that kind of a environment where any moment could be your last, right? How do you convey that to somebody, especially your own son, right? And there are commonalities in my field of alien abductions and whatnot. And I've been at the sharp end as far as not just with alien abductions, but deep black military interference and deep black military harassment, actually. And there are things that it's difficult for us to share with others who haven't gone through that because of the ridicule factor and all these other issues, which I'll get into. So a bit more about me. My dad was in the Navy, brown water Navy, and then later on he segued into the aircraft carriers, pre-nuclear aircraft carriers. And so as a youth, my family just followed my dad around from one naval air station to another. And then lo and behold, fast forward to my adulthood, I wind up getting a job in, of all places, Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego, NAS North Island, which is one of the premier birthplaces, so-called, for naval aviation. Another place is Pensacola in Florida. And it was at the airfield that I worked at, some of the greats flew off there, people like Jimmy Doolittle and others. And so I worked at ComNav AirPac, Commander Naval Air Force's U.S. Pacific Fleet, in communications. So I was essentially in the intelligence community. And so because of my background, having studied a lot of this stuff, military history and geopolitics and what have you, and then to find myself in one of the key nodal points of the military intelligence community in communications, what probably didn't seem meaningful or didn't matter much to other people, when I read some of these intelligence summaries, or information from all these different sources, it was not only intelligence branches of the theater level commands, but it was also down to like Army, mostly it was Air Force and Marine aviation that naval aviation dealt with. We didn't really have much connection or message traffic from Army, but we did get a lot of stuff from Defense Intelligence Agency. We did get a lot of stuff from Naval Intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So point being, I would read all this stuff, and because of my background of having studied a lot of this most of my life, I got a good idea what was going on around the world, right? And so that was what was going on in the background. And then I started having all these experiences, and it compelled me to do research, right? In order to push through the fear, where after some of these alien abductions, Chris, I was so skittish, I wouldn't sleep with the lights off. Like where I lived, there's one place in San Jose, California, my friends had free reign to come up to my window and tap on it. And I was so skittish after a while, I would just freak out when people would tap on my window. I'd give out a yelp, because I was traumatized basically. So my way of overcoming the fear was to delve into the books. And so what I always tell people nowadays, especially those that I encourage to try to, if they want to get into UFO alien abduction type research, get into the books. It's go old school, because a lot of times when you go online and you go on YouTube or you go, web surfing, it's very subjective. These algorithms that Google and other search engines develop, they may not get you to the information you need, right? It's very subjective. It's very arbitrary. So especially nowadays, because we have the means to order online great book websites like bookdepository.com there in the UK, and other websites, you can order just about anything you want. And so I encourage people to go old school when studying UFOs, alien abduction, et cetera, and get your nose into the books. And this is what I did in the early 1990s, because we didn't have the internet back then. I had it at work where I worked at the air base, but I didn't have it at home until a little while later. And so I just immersed myself in these books. And what happened, that was interesting, Chris, was there came a point in time when I realized that the military and the government and the intelligence agencies, elements thereof, were deeply, deeply interested in the UFO alien abduction, alien technology aspects, right? One of the most important books I ever read was the Roswell, I think the UFO crash at Roswell. Donald Schmidt was the co-writer for that book. The other co-writer turned into a debunker of alien abductions later on. So he was probably always on a leash anyway, intelligence-wise. But anyway, his co-author was Donald Schmidt, who went on to write a great book called Eyewitness to Roswell, co-written by Tom Carey, who was a former Air Force intelligence guy with a top-secret crypto clearance. And so anyway, getting back to that first Roswell book, it talked about a clandestine retrieval of a crashed alien spacecraft outside of Roswell, New Mexico. And see, that's stuff that was right up my alley. Covert operations. I mean, not that I took part in it, but that I was deeply immersed in reading about that. Because when I delved into special operations, Chris, I started as a basic starting point, World War II, the OSS, SOE, the stay behind parties in Malaya and elsewhere. And so, and how the OSS and U.S. Airborne morphed into the American Army Special Forces. And so I was familiar with that as a background, that there is a black world that's separate from this regular world that we exist in. And so when I read this book about how the military covertly recovered this craft, or wreckage of it, actually, and there's probably more than one craft that was recovered during that period of time, the transition for me was as simple as rolling over in bed, because I've been reading about military stuff all my life. And then when I realized that there were so many key players, actual individuals with identifiable military backgrounds that were involved in that recovery effort, well, the light bulb went on. And it occurred to me that the military has known about this at least as far back as the 1940s, if not sooner. Right. And so that really helped me. And what was interesting also, let me take a sip because I'm starting to develop a frog in my throat.
Yeah.
Because I lived in San Diego, which is a big time military city, Chris, my colleagues in the UFO field that did research were likewise, many of them had a military background. One of my friends that was a UFO researcher was a former UDT who transitioned to the Navy SEALs later. I knew another guy that worked at Point Loma, and his job was SOSUS, sound surveillance undersea, the hydrophone arrays that are set up to be able to track submarines. Okay, he was another guy that was a UFO researcher. I knew another UFO researcher who was worked with Naval Research Labs there at Point Loma. Point Loma is where I don't know about now, but back then they had the hunter-killer fast attack boats on the West Coast were based there. So that, just to give an idea of the kind of people that were interested in this. And some of the people that I looked up to, because I was kind of like in a transitional mode. Like back then there was the people that I looked to, and you might have heard this in your days in the military, Chrissy. You find someone who you really admire and you want to emulate and be like them because they, represent everything that you want to get out of your time in the military, right? Well, for me, as a UFO researcher, I looked at the people that had a similar interest in me as me, but had already taken it quite a distance, right? People like Bill Hamilton, who was ex-Air Force Security Service, which now is known as the Air Force Electronic Security Command, a subsidiary of the NSA. He was a Russian linguist, a computer expert, and he was deeply involved in UFO research. In fact, he developed sources in the underground aerospace corporations in the Antelope Valley in high desert of Southern California, where a lot of these next generation aircraft are developed, right? There's Air Force Plant 42 there, there's the Lockheed Hellendale facility there, et cetera, right? He developed sources in the underground bases there who talked about seeing and working with alien technology, who even talked about seeing actual non-human life forms, aliens in some of these underground bases, which for those who really delve into this subject matter, this comes up again and again, and this has been going on for decades. And there's other people like another one of my colleagues who died an untimely death, Dr. Carla Turner. She was a university professor in Old English Studies. Her husband, Elton, was a SIGINT guy who worked in West Berlin during the Cold War, right, for Army Security Agency, which is another subsidiary for the NSA. He'd had alien abduction experiences, as his wife, Carla, right? That's how he got into all this. And plus, because he was trained in spotting surveillance and trained in counter surveillance, he knew very quickly that he and his wife became the objects of scrutiny. There was these spooky people in government cars following them around. They were hearing strange noises on their phones, which I went through later, the phone taps and all that stuff. And so I'm just giving a background to your listeners because what they've done, Chris, with the main weapon used against serious UFO research is ridicule, right? And now we see this playing out all over the place, where in almost any field of investigation, if it runs counter to whatever consensus narrative is being put out, well, the whole mainstream media erupts in scorn and ridicule, and now the social media will do the same. All these paid trolls will just rise up out of nowhere and just start pointing and shrieking. Well, us people that were involved in serious UFO research, alien abduction research, we were the first ones that had to go through all that ridicule. And the ridicule policy against UFOs originally officially came into being in 1953, January 1953, when the CIA put together the Robertson panel. And the reason they put together the Robertson panel was in July 1952, a scant 6 months before, the restricted airspace over Washington, D.C. was inundated with flying saucers on 2 successive weekends. There were hundreds of witnesses on the ground and in the air, and there were very good radar locks. And what the Air Force had to do to allay the near state of hysteria the public was in, you can imagine flying saucers right over the White House, right? Groups of them. They held the largest military press conference since World War II. Major General John Samford, who was the head of Air Force Intelligence, later became a director of the National Security Agency. And also General Roger Ramey, who at the time of Roswell was the 8th Air Force commander, and he actually held some of the wreckage in his hands. He was the one that basically ordered Major Marcel, the intelligence officer from the 509th Bomb Wing, in Roswell, who brought some of the wreckage over from New Mexico, he basically ordered Major Marcel to pose with junk, tinfoil, balsa wood, the remains of a weather balloon, to pose with it and then claim that, well, all the hullabaloo, all the fuss was about this weather balloon that I mistook for a flying saucer. So they made Major Jesse Marcel a laughingstock, right? Well, anyway, those were the two guys that headed up that press briefing in Washington, D.C. And the upshot was, well, it was just temperature inversions. You know, the heat caused all these radar blips to appear, which weren't really there, which neatly sidestepped all the eyewitness reports in the air and on the ground. So the point being is that all the hysteria that came about from UFOs flying over the restricted airspace in Washington, D.C. in July 1952 led the CIA to promulgate the creation of the Robertson panel, headed up by Dr. H.P. Robertson, who played a key role in the study and exploitation. One of the things he did of recovered German weaponry from World War II. He was a high-level scientific advisor for what was then the Defense Department. And the upshot of the Robertson panel was they, in order to allay public interest in the UFO subject, which had reached hysterical proportions by that point, they had to institute a policy, an official policy of ridiculing witnesses with the media and using academics to debunk and explain away the sightings, right? Now, the ridicule part, using the media to ridicule witnesses, and it works wonders in dissuading people to come forward with any further sightings or reports. That took on this inertia to the point today, Chris, when you mention aliens and flying saucers in mixed company, you get, you know, the laughter curtain goes up, the snickers and the eyes rolling, and, you know, and before we came on here, you wanted to talk about the, I think it's called the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Threat Assessment Unit in the Pentagon. Okay, now that's important. We need to address that issue because, to me, the threat assessment group, with a measly budget of like 22, 25 million, I mean, that won't even pay for like a fraction of a stealth fighter, right? This is a limited hangout in intelligence terms. It's a way of regaining control of the narrative. And to me, it's a latter-day version of Project Blue Book from 1949 to about 1969. The Air Force had this organization called Blue Book, which sought to, it was an officially sanctioned disinformation agency, Chris, to explain away all these sightings. Meanwhile, right, all this other stuff had gone on in the background. And before, I'm just going to mention a few things and a few more names, and I'll turn it over to you, just to show how high level this is, right? And how this threat assessment program, to me, with a Mickey Mouse budget of 20 some odd million, I don't take it seriously as a real intelligence operation to get all the information out there, because the information for a diligent researcher has been available for decades now. Let me just throw a few names out, which some of your listeners will be familiar with, I'm sure. I mentioned I'm a student of World War II. Well, a lot of your listeners will know who Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding is. Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding was the head of RAF Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. In fact, prior to World War II, he headed up the Royal Air Force Research and Development branch. And he worked closely with the telecommunications research establishment that was developing radar. And out of that came the development of the chain home radar system, which played a pivotal role in the Battle of Britain. So the guy who was directly involved and directly responsible for creating the radar sites which made it possible to vector in the fabled few RAF fighter pilots, vector them into incoming Luftwaffe bomber streams, was Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command. Now, Hugh Dowding stated, for the record, flying saucers are serious business. Full stop. Not only that, but he said he's particularly interested in the reports of the occupants of the flying saucers, the reports by average everyday citizens who've seen a parked or landed flying saucer or other unknown craft and have seen occupants come out of it. So Hugh Dowding was deeply interested in that. So people can take a shot at me, oh, who's this James Bartley guy? He's a nobody, right? They're going to have a more difficult time trying to explain away why the hero of the Battle of Britain made those kinds of comments. Here's another person I'll throw out at the viewers. General Curtis Emerson LeMay, who wound up becoming Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. He was the premier bombardier, premier navigator of what was then the U.S. Army Air Forces. As head of the 305th Bomb Group in England, he pioneered the defensive formations to maximize the firepower for the B-17s. All of the 50 cals that were sticking out of the side turrets and then the belly turrets and et cetera, et cetera. He pioneered those kinds of box-shaped configurations to maximize the defensive firepower, because at that point, as you know, and many of your listeners will know, the Americans nor the British at that time had a fighter plane that could accompany the bombers into Germany and back. They go so far as France, and then they turn around, and then here come the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs, right? So he had to develop a means to counter that. He also pioneered the straight-on approach for bombing targets, because when he took over the 305th Bomb Group, what they did, it sounds crazy now, was they zigzagged towards the targets. And LeMay said, well, wait a minute. Okay, we're going to take our losses, it's true. But if we continue with the zigzagging business to drop our bombs on our targets and we miss, we're just going to have to come back again. And we're going to lose more people, more planes, et cetera, right? So he pioneered, the straight-on approach, which then became standard throughout the 8th Air Force. He later was promoted to be the wing commander, and then he later on took over Project Matterhorn, China, Burma, India Theater, the B-29 superfortresses. From there, he went to the Marianas, and ultimately, for a time, commanded the 20th Air Force. He was the one that many of your viewers will know instituted the firebombing campaign on Japan, which reduced many of their cities to ash. In fact, he bombed so many cities with a firebombing technique that General Hap Arnold told him to go back to Washington, D.C. and explain to the American Chiefs of Staff that we don't really have any more targets to firebomb over there. Now, they did set aside a few cities to be bombed by the A-bombs, because they wanted them pristine, so that way they can determine just how strong these A-bombs were. So there were several cities that were untouchable up to that point. But everything else pretty much had been firebombed, right? And then after World War II, he goes into Air Force Research and Development. Eventually, he becomes commander of Strategic Air Command. And he changed Strategic Air Command from being what was regarded as a SAD SAC outfit, SAC, Strategic Air Command, and he turned it into one of the most potent forces of all time, right? In fact, LeMay played a key role in creating the RAND Corporation, which a lot of your viewers will know that RAND is a major think tank these days. Anyway, in his memoirs, which I read, Mission with LeMay, General Curtis LeMay says, flying saucers are real. they're real, but we can never really figure them out, which was a lie. Because, like I said, at the time of post-World War II, he was in Air Force R&D, and reliable witnesses developed by the late, great Leonard Stringfield. If there's a Mount Olympus of UFO researchers, the late, great Leonard Stringfield would be on that Mount Olympus. He was an Air Force intelligence officer for the 5th Air Force in World War II in New Guinea and in the Philippines. And Leonard Stringfield pioneered investigations into what he called crash retrievals, the retrieval of crashed alien spacecraft. From the crash site, the transportation back to one or more secure locations, and also not only debriefing people that were on the actual recovery teams, but also people who happened to be in some of these secure facilities, who happened to see an alien body in conditions of deep freeze refrigeration, or have seen a recovered craft in a hangar or something. Anyway, one of Stringfield's sources told him at the time of Roswell, a number of big shots flew into what was then known as Alamogordo Field, which later became Kirtland Air Force Base, the Kirtland Air Force Base, Sandia Complex in New Mexico. And this source of Stringfield said Curtis LeMay was there, right? Another interesting story about Curtis LeMay was Barry Goldwater was a very powerful senator in America. I thought he would have made a great president, but they ridiculed him and everything else, and because the establishment didn't like him. Anyway, he was the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, a very powerful position. And he had a reserve commission as an Air Force general, and he had a top secret clearance for the Air Force too. Barry Goldwater found out that there were alien artifacts stored in the Foreign Technology Division building at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he tried to gain access to it. But as you know, Chris, and as I know personally, because I was in communications, it doesn't matter how high someone's clearance is. If they don't have a need to know, they don't have a need to know. So Senator Barry Goldwater, the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, was turned away. And then he gets a call from General Curtis LeMay, and they have a meeting, and these are two alpha males, right? And LeMay proceeds to tear Goldwater up one side and down the other and says, don't ever, ever try to get in there or ask about that again, right? So, and there's a couple more names to throw out there for your listeners, right? This is more from the scientific angle and the engineering angle. One of the smoking guns of UFO research, in my estimation, is the letter that Dr. Robert Sarbarker, who at the time was the dean of the Washington Institute of Technology. In the 1950s, he was an unpaid consultant for the Pentagon with a very high security clearance. He also had, Dr. Robert Sarbarker also had his own missile development company. Well, long story, but one of the great indefatigable researchers of the old days, who since passed away, William Steinman, found out that Dr. Robert Sarbarker had been involved at some level with the analysis of recovered alien technology, and peppered him with a stream of letters, right? Finally, Dr. Sarbarker wrote back, William Steinman, and you can find this letter on the internet, right? A photocopy of it. He was specifically asked about the UFO crash retrieval at Aztec, New Mexico in March 1948, which we now know, those of us in the field now know it to have been a real recovery. For decades after the recovery of the craft, an intact flying saucer with a number of gray alien bodies inside of it. It was the first deployment that we know of the Interplanetary Phenomena Unit, the IPU, within Army Counterintelligence, the Army Counterintelligence Corps, which was set up specifically to take part in these crash retrievals, and they've been succeeded over time by special units within the Air Force and other units, right? So responding specifically to the Aztec case, which for decades, even ufologists thought was a hoax and rubbished it and everything else. We now know that it really happened, right? He went on to say that he's aware of the recovery that he's talking about. And he went on to name some names, which I thought was very interesting. When you can find the secret saucer scientists and the secret saucer engineers, it's very much like spy catching, Chris. You find one, they'll lead you to more if you know what questions to ask. So the upshot of it in that letter was William Steinman had asked specifically he gave him a list of scientists and engineers. Which one, because Steinman's sources had told him these guys were involved in this crash retrieval. Some of these guys were at the site in Aztec, New Mexico in March 1948. So he provided a list to Sarbarker, right? What Sarbarker said in response was, all I could say is that the material that was recovered was very light but very tough. Some of the so-called aliens were built constructed anatomically similar to insects that we've observed on Earth, right? And there are certain ET races we call insectoids or praying mantis types. There's different types of ETs. And Sarbarker postulated in the letter that perhaps because of the inertial mass and the high acceleration of some of these devices, these craft, it's easier for these insect-like beings to survive, right? He went on to say that as far as the people that you've named and my knowledge of their involvement, all I can say is the following. He said, Dr. John von Neumann was definitely involved. Dr. Vannevar Bush was definitely involved. And Dr. Robert Oppenheimer was probably involved. And he went on to say that they probably consulted with Dr. Werner von Braun, who at that time was working in Fort Bliss. A lot of the work with the recovered V-2 rockets and whatnot, Fort Bliss, Texas. Now, just a quick word about who these guys are. Who's Dr. John von Neumann? Well, Dr. John von Neumann was a consultant to the Manhattan Project, a computer scientist, and an expert in explosives, actually, also. World famous Hungarian scientist. And it was, a lot of people say that he was like the father of modern computing. Well, he was one of them. As a matter of fact, that he played a role in helping to get Alan Turing a placement in Princeton in the Institute of Advanced Studies prior to World War II. And then, of course, Turing went on to play a key role at Bletchley Park with the Enigma ciphers. John von Neumann was definitely involved, Manhattan Project consultant. Dr. Vannevar Bush was definitely involved. Who was Dr. Vannevar Bush? Dr. Vannevar Bush was the top scientific advisor of his day. He formed the National Defense Research Council, and then after that, he formed the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, out of which came the Manhattan Project. Dr. Vannevar Bush was the dean of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, out of which a lot of other military applications were developed or perfected, like the proximity fuse and long-range navigational aids and whatnot. And then he went on, of course, to mention Dr. Robert Oppenheimer was probably involved. And then on top of that, get this, he mentioned Dr. Carl Compton in particular, who at the time, back in the 1950s when all this was going on, because remember, he's writing about something that happened decades before. Dr. Carl Compton was the director of the Joint Army-Navy Research and Development Board. He was the brother of Dr. Arthur Compton, who won a Nobel Prize for research in cosmic rays. Now, today, it's very fashionable for people to say, oh, well, all these UFOs people are seeing, that's just DARPA. just advanced craft developed by DARPA. That's like putting the cart before the horse, because the Joint Army-Navy Research Development Board went through a number of name changes and eventually became DARPA. So for people to say nowadays, oh, well, these craft people are seeing, they're just man-made craft developed by DARPA, when DARPA used to be the Joint Army-Navy Research Development Board, whose very scientists and engineers were involved with the actual hardware, right, of recovered alien technology. And one more bit and one more name I'll throw out there to bring it, even more up to the present time. Ben Rich was the longtime director of the Lockheed Skunk Works. He was a protege of Kelly Johnson. Clarence Johnson went by the nickname Kelly. It was Kelly Johnson who chose Area 51, which was also known as Watertown Strip, because that was where the Atomic Energy Commission had a naval airstrip there during World War II. Anyway, Kelly Johnson, P-38 Lightning, and a bunch of other iconic craft from World War II. His protege was Ben Rich. Ben Rich eventually became a director of the Skunk Works, Lockheed's advanced development wing. In what amounted to a deathbed confession, Ben Rich said to Tom Keller, an aerospace engineer and a consultant for the Mutual UFO Network, Ben Rich told him that, yes, there are real UFOs, ours and theirs. They really exist. And I'm paraphrasing here because he said this in more than one occasion, right? But he said that the military are already flying the stars. Anything you can imagine, we can already do. And Jim Goodall, who I've had on my show twice, Jim Goodall is a world-renowned expert on the F-117 stealth. In fact, he's the first one to ever come up with a picture of the F-117 stealth fighter. And he's a longtime Area 51 watcher, longtime Tonopah test range watcher. And Jim Goodall has written dozens of books. His most recent books were about, not only has he written books about the SR-71, which is his particular baby, but because he worked on SR-71 back in the day. But he also wrote books about the latest generations of nuclear submarines. Anyway, Ben Rich told Jim Goodall that we have things, we have craft and technology 50 years beyond your comprehension. He didn't say 50 years beyond your understanding of engineering or understanding of aviation. He said 50 years beyond your comprehension. Anything you can imagine, we can already do, is what Ben Rich told Jim Goodall. And Jim Goodall stated, for the record, that if there's anyone out there at the time when Ben Rich was still alive, if there's anyone out there who has hands-on experience with the actual hardware of recovered alien technology, it would be Ben Rich, right? And so I'm just throwing a few names out there of a historical nature, because when I do research, these are the kind of avenues I head into, the deep, black, weird science, military, aerospace aspects, because a lot of that dovetails in the alien abduction stuff, because many people who are legitimate alien abductees on occasion are kidnapped by deep black elements of the military aerospace, utilized basically as mind-controlled operatives. They're even trained, Chris. They're trained in paramilitary activities. They're trained in escape and evasion. They're trained in weaponry, right? So, and that's a whole nother subject. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there to your listeners.
Wow. I'll tell you what, James, I'm really honored to just be a part of this conversation. They talk about imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
So for people listening, imposter syndrome is where you might do your job. Let's just say you're, I don't know, a racing driver, But every time you get behind the wheel of the car, even though you might be the world champion, you still feel like a fake, because you kind of like know your limitations, and they call it imposter syndrome. It's I almost feel genuinely imposter syndrome in this conversation, because I'm much more of a structural person. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to disengage myself from this amazing subject here. I can't wait to discuss it. But I just wanted to say I'm really, it's like I've been invited on the X-Files or something, and I get to access all of this incredible alternative knowledge, isn't it, really? Or it's not mainstream, and that's the sort of stuff I love.
Yeah, and you know, the problem is that we were talking about earlier, Chris, is that the information is out there. If someone has the will to find it, and you know how it is, the way the universe works, you know, the way the intentions go out, and then how information comes back in the most unexpected of ways. And you know, before we take a break, I can tell you a personal story. I've debriefed a number of people over the years, okay, and some of the people that I know personally are well known in the field and have gone through a lot of hardship, a lot of harassment, a lot of ridicule, even especially within the UFO field. The UFO field has always been this like bickering, kind of acrimonious arena where there's like egos and empires, and a lot of jealousy and a lot of backbiting. And you know, one of the guys that I knew, he's well known in the field. He was interviewed by Timothy Good in the book Above Top Secret, which is a classic in the UFO field. The subtitle is it's Above Top Secret, the Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. And the whole book, it's a thick book, it's chock-a-block with accounts from military people, particularly all over the world, right? So anyway, this guy I know, Guy Kirkwood, he was interviewed by Tim Good in that book, and he went under the pseudonym of Mel Noel. And what Guy did was, in the early 1950s, he was part of a reserve unit of 4 F-86 Sabres that were based in Salt Lake City, right, at a private airport there. Anyway, they got pulled into active duty. A colonel came from the Pentagon, an Air Force colonel, who proceeded to teach them flying maneuvers, right? What they did was they removed the machine guns out of the wings and replaced them with gun cameras. Long story short, Guy Kirkwood found himself in a special unit of F-86 Sabres that were tasked with flying back and forth between Salt Lake City Airport and Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho for the express purpose of intercepting flying saucers and getting gun camera footage of the intercepts. And over a span of about 4 months, they made contact on 4 different occasions. And they were told before, when they were briefed into this, they were told you can expect interference in communications, you can expect problems with your instrumentation, your altimeter, your compass, et cetera, you can expect to hear a high level of static, right, in your comms, and all that stuff happened. He said every time they made contact, they had like 4 encounters, and they would run into like formations of flying saucers. Every time they would land, the 4 planes would be replaced by brand new ones. The gun camera footage would always be taken away. They never even got to see the film footage they took. They didn't have a need to know. He said all they know is it was probably taken the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base or some other place for evaluation. Now, after the 4th time that they encountered these flying saucers, remember they're flying back and forth from Salt Lake City, Utah to Mountain Air Force Base in Idaho and back. After the 4th encounter, when they landed, they started experiencing what we would now call PTSD. They started cracking up, basically, right? And then they talked amongst each other, amongst themselves, the four of them. They said, the next time this happens, we could be in the plane, flying, surrounded by these things in the air. It's like, I don't want to go through that. So as a group, the four pilots, and I don't know if Guy is still alive, but the other three have passed away. They've since passed away. They all got together and they said, we're going to ask them to take us off this project. And they told them, give us a Section 8, psychiatric, whatever it takes, just get us off this thing, right? Because they were saying amongst themselves, if the emissions or the energies emitted by these craft are such that it interferes with their communications, it interferes with their instrumentation, their avionics, right? It's like, what is it doing to us? Are we going to come out of this thing babbling idiots, right? And that's a very legitimate, because when one delves into just a segue for a second, when one delves into UFO encounters, especially low-level encounters that people, motorists or people, pedestrians have with craft, there's actually a very real danger of radiological effects. In fact, this is an actual true thing. In 1994, there was the infamous United States Federal Firefighter Guide, where there was a chapter devoted to the dangers of disabled or fallen alien craft, and it specifically mentioned the radiological effects, right? So, and there's hordes of cases of people getting too close to UFOs and flying saucers and other types of alien craft, and then they wind up getting like severe radiation poisoning, among other things, right? So anyway, these four pilots got together and said, no, let's get out of this program because we don't want anything more to do with it. And so they gave him a Section 8. Well, I don't think they gave him a Section 8, but they said, give us a Section 8 if that's what it takes, psychiatric. So they let him out of the program. They made him sign non-disclosure statements, told him never to talk about it. Now, some years down the track, Guy started talking about it, right? And one time he was about to come onto a TV show in America when he was confronted by a CIA guy, side stage, flashed him some credentials and said, you're not going out there, right? Or else. And he said he was intimidated and he didn't talk for a long time after that. As a matter of fact, some of your viewers might know that there was a National Press Club conference of military UFO witnesses, or former military witnesses who somehow or other garnered information about ETs and aliens and UFOs during their time in service. And there was a number of people there, former radar specialists, people that worked at some of the nuclear, Strategic Air Command nuclear bases. And these aliens of different stripes, they've had a long-standing interest in the weapons of mass destruction of the governments of this planet. And there have been numerous cases when UFOs have literally caused like upwards of 20 Minutemen ballistic missiles to go offline, what they call a fated giant, right? One time this happened in 1966, and the launch control officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base at the time, a guy named Robert Salas, I think he was part of that National Press Club conference in Washington, D.C. Well, Guy Kirkwood was invited to take part in that, to talk about what I just told you about the photo intercepts and whatnot. The day before he was about to fly out from San Diego, California, to Washington, D.C. to take part in this this National Press Club conference, he got an anonymous phone call and was told, if you take part in this, while you're gone, we're going to burn your house down, right? So he decided not to take part in it. Now, a lot of people in the UFO field know about that National Press Club conference, and they remember, the testimony of a number of these former military witnesses. Guy was supposed to be there, but he wasn't. Right? Here's another interesting thing. Well, Guy introduced me to Gordon Cooper before Gordon Cooper passed away. Gordon Cooper was the Mercury astronaut, the first American that we know of that flew in space, right? Gordon Cooper, as an Air Force colonel, knew a lot about UFOs. In fact, he had his own UFO encounter as a fighter pilot in Germany after World War II. And then later, he was working at Edwards Air Force Base, and he was supervising a photo camera team. And this photo camera team had set up their equipment there in the dry lake bed. They were expecting to take footage of an experimental craft, right? Next thing you know, this saucer lands there, legs come out from the bottom of this thing, and it parks there on the dry lake bed. Now, this camera team, they thought, oh, this must be it, right? They had no idea that they were being spoofed by aliens. So they took all this film footage. They didn't have video in those days, of course, right? Now, Gordon Cooper was not there at the time. He came back later on, and he was talking to these guys. Oh, yeah, this saucer landed, and it was amazing, and here's all the footage, right? What Gordon Cooper did was he went into his office, and he held the negative up to a light, and he saw clearly that there was a landed saucer on the dry lake bed with legs sticking out from underneath it. What happened was, after a while, the craft lifted up, the legs retracted, then it flew away. And the camera crew packed away their gear. They were thinking, I guess that was it, right? No, it wasn't it. They were supposed to be filming something entirely terrestrial, right? Anyway, long story short was, Gordon Cooper gets on the phone. He calls up Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Hey, do you guys have any experimental craft flying around here? Oh, you don't? Well, this is what happened, right? And they told him, put everything in a box, and we'll send somebody to take it over, right? To come by, pick it up, and take it away. And that's what happened, right? He didn't have the need to know to run the actual film. All he did was he was able to look through a negative, beneath a light bulb, right? And the same guy, Kirkwood, the pilot that I told you about, he introduced me because we did a research trip to Area 51. Well, actually, the town, little burg next to it called Rachel. And because there was a UFO conference there. I think he was speaking, I was speaking, I can't remember, it was a long time ago. But after the conference, we took a little drive out to the desert, a little ways. We went to visit a friend of his. I didn't know who we were going to visit. It turned out we went to visit Bo Greitz. Now, some of your viewers might know who Bo Greitz is. Bo Greitz was a living legend in American Special Forces in Southeast Asia. He commanded one of those Mike Force, quick reaction force units, mostly of Montagnards and several American Special Forces advisors. And then when, for example, if an A-team was being overrun somewhere in some remote camp, Bo Greitz and the Mike Force would show up, right? They were a quick reaction force. Now, years later, when he was stationed in Panama, Bo Greitz was he was approached by somebody to take part in a clandestine mission to Southeast Asia to determine if there were any living remaining MIAs, missing in action POWs. Now, of course, Bo Greitz said, yeah, I'll go for that. So he was recruited into a highly classified Pentagon unit known as the Intelligence Support Activity, the ISA. They gave him a bunch of, SATCOM equipment. They gave him a bunch of photographic equipment. They gave him the wherewithal to recruit his own team. Long story short, he goes to Southeast Asia, and he finds out, among other things, because he actually had to sit down with Kun Sa, the Burmese warlord, opium grower, right, who told him, Bo Greitz, that, you know what, we don't want to grow all this opium. We just want to grow our own stuff. But you're CIA, and he specifically mentioned Theodore Shackley, the infamous, for a time he was head of CIA operations in Laos. Later on, he became involved in all kinds of shenanigans, Theodore Shackley. And he also mentioned, Kun Sa did, the Burmese warlord, he specifically mentioned Santo Traficante Jr., who was the big-time Florida mob boss, who was a longtime CIA asset. That both at different times, Theodore Shackley and Santo Traficante Jr. would go to Burma to make sure that they, were running their opium heroin operation the way they should, because the CIA was running drugs out of Southeast Asia. Anyway, Bo Greitz goes there to find out about MIAs, comes back with this information, right? So what do? They bust him at a border checkpoint. They spin the media out to make it look like he did this entirely on his own. They even lied and said that he'd stolen this SATCOM equipment, which they gave him, right? So the point of relevance was Guy Kirkwood took me to meet Bo Greitz, right? And what's the first thing that Bo Greitz asked Guy Kirkwood? What's going on in the UFO field? What's going on at Area 51? Tell me, right? So, just the point of relevance is that the people that I've met, the people I've spoken to, ex-Special Forces people, ex-Naval Intelligence people, right? Another quick story, and I'd like your take on some of this, was I was about to tell the story earlier, but I got sidetracked. I met this guy, and how I met him was interesting, right? I got to know this black gentleman, really cool guy. And he said, well, his father's a minister. They got their own congregation in East County, San Diego. He invited me along, right? Well, come to the congregation. You might like it, right? Didn't really want to do that. I got to talking to him, got to know him, a cup of coffee here and there. And I mentioned my interest in UFOs. And then this guy tells me, well, that's interesting because the guy that does our audio-visual work at the church, he used to be in U.S. Naval Intelligence, and he said he's seen alien bodies, and he's seen recovered alien craft. And of course, my ears pricked up at that point. So I said, okay, I'll check out your congregation, right? It sounds cynical, I know, right? So over a course of about 6 Sundays, I kept going to this church. And I would see this guy, right? He'd be doing the audio-visual thing. He'd be standing there at this podium. But I was never able to meet him alone for any length of time. My friend said, I'll arrange a meeting with you, right? With this guy. Finally, several weeks down the track, I finally have a sit down with this guy. And he told me an interesting story. He said he was attached to a unit of Naval Intelligence, a black gentleman, right? Because it was an all-black congregation. He said that he was in Naval Intelligence and he was a radar specialist. He worked at a secret base in the Arctic Circle. And this guy was a student of intelligence history too, because he was telling me all this stuff about, the original formation of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Group, which preceded the CIA. He knew about all that stuff, right? So I start to debrief him essentially about what he witnessed at this facility. He said it was a top secret facility in the Arctic Circle where we specifically monitored alien UFO activity. Much of the activity went on, they had undersea bases there. Another one of the, just to digress for a second, another one of the all-time great UFO researchers was the late retired Air Force Colonel Wendell Stevens, who was a former test pilot with Air Force Technical Intelligence Center. And during his stint in the Air Force, he was part of a classified operation out of Alaska, still the Arctic Circle, where they loaded down these modified B-29s with all kinds of special cameras for the express purpose of, like that other guy I was talking about, to take pictures and film footage and all this other stuff of aliens and UFOs, basically, right? So when I heard this thing about the Arctic Circle and how this guy used to work there, this black guy used to work with Naval Intelligence, well, I already had a correlation there. And that's what we look for in our field, pattern data correlations, right? From people who don't know each other that are telling a same or a similar story. So he said he is at this facility in the Arctic Circle His job was to, do the radar, one of a number of people. And he said very frequently there would be blips and UFOs all over the place on his radar screens. He said on one occasion they recovered a cigar-shaped craft. Nowadays, everyone's talking about tic-tac-shaped craft. Back then, in the old days, we always referred to cigar-shaped or cylindrical craft. He said it was a recovered cigar-shaped craft, and he'd seen some of the alien bodies. And he said that they were gray bodies. They were gray aliens, right? Now, it took me several weeks just to meet this guy, right? But see, that's what it takes, Chris. If you want the information, that's what you've got to do. And also, and one last thing, the late, great Anthony Dodd was a UK UFO investigator. His sources in NATO and his sources in the Royal Navy likewise told him that there is a big alien base undersea in the Arctic Circle, and that some of the NATO fleet exercises involving multiple nations had encounters, run-ins with some of these craft on occasion. So again, it's another pattern data correlation. But yeah, if you have any questions or comments.
My gosh. So here's the thing, James, right? My first sort of point of reference would be the structural perspective, right? I've got loads of things we can talk about. I've written, like, while you've been talking, I've written 8 topics down that I'd be interested to hear your viewpoint on. But here's the thing, right? We're at a stage in our humanity where I personally feel, and we don't have to mention the whys and the mechanisms that are in place, because we're going to get ourselves in trouble, and certainly on certain platforms we can't talk about it. But I would say there's never been a more frightening time since I've been alive, and it's now. For the previous generation or generations, it was the Second World War was an equally as frightening event, and before that, and for you guys, I think I mentioned earlier, Vietnam. What I'm getting to, James, is we are being massively controlled, right? Massively. I would put forward, because I can only say what I see, but I'd say there's an elitist group in society. I would think of them as, like, let's just call them a global mafia. I think they're incredibly deep thinkers, very long game players. And in addition to that, they thoroughly understand human psychology. And if you can understand human psychology, then you can understand how to scare people, how to control people, rather. I mean, a silly example of that is, everybody knows if you hide behind a door and jump out on someone, what do? They knock my office down. But they jump. It's just that's just a small example of how you can understand human psychology. These guys have been doing this, I would argue, thousands of years. I think history shows they've been doing it for thousands of years. And here's where the link that I'm trying to make. It's really hard to even begin to address the alien UFO arena and incidents and the possible technologies and the players, when we don't even know what's going on our planet, on this planet, and we're not even prepared to, or we're not even capable of banding together as primates, or whatever you want to bloody call us, a global community, human beings, to realize what is being done to us. Most people cannot even see it. The psychology, for whatever reason, whether they've been controlled, whether they've been indoctrinated, brainwashed through mainstream media, whatever it is, the sad fact is the majority of people cannot see that we are all being made slaves. At the moment, it's in our own homes with the, you know, the drones are going to deliver your pizza and your Amazon orders now. You people will now chat to people on something called the internet. You don't actually go outside your home cocoon to meet face to face with other human beings, as you have done for the last million years or whatever, you know, since we evolved from whatever we've evolved from, right? On top of that, we've lost the critical ability to think. I don't know if we ever had it. Sorry to say that. I mean, I just mean, like, you couldn't really get a more stupid human being than what we've ended up as, to the point where you ask somebody about a game show or a soap opera on the television, and they can tell you what happened for the last 3 years, almost as if they wrote the script for that program. You ask them, like, what should you eat to be healthy? And they're like, all they can do is repeat what the food corporations have brainwashed them into believing is healthy, right? One example, loads of stuff. I mean, you ask the average person, and remember, I love humanity. I love the universe. I love everybody. This is not a critique of the individual. I'm saying that for me to manifest this beautiful community that we could be, right? And to start to address the wrongs and that sort of stuff, that I have to talk from this structural perspective. We have to be, you know, take a hit here, guys. If you think you're this person, then listen, right? But I'm trying to make the link between your wonderful presentation, James, of a side of life I haven't seen, and the link I'm making is these people that are doing this to us work out of order, out of chaos. They know we are so stupid or confused or busy or hectic or angry or emotional or whatever, we cannot question their control, because we're too busy arguing with somebody on Facebook about, you know, whether, you know, about colors, about shooting animals in Africa, whatever it might be. There's just this abundance of anger and animosity and misunderstanding that just envelops our everyday life from the moment we get up and we put that thing on called a device, you know, whether that be a phone, a tablet, or a PC. We don't have a space in our life or our mind to even begin to start thinking rationally, right? So my whole point with I don't know if you call it the UFO agenda, is, does it add to the chaos? If the answer is yes, it's these fuckers again, right? I'm not disputing anything you say, James. I wouldn't be so rude, and I would never question your experiences, because I don't have that right. I would never question your knowledge. I wouldn't dispute the people you've quoted. I mean, I haven't met them. I can tell you, I'll give you kind of another structural perspective on the military that people who haven't been in the military might be interested in. You know, for example, the military guys that, let's say they want us to believe went to the moon, are allegedly all Freemasons. So that kind of gives you a very interesting, when you remember to belong to an esoteric group, you generally swear allegiance to that group, not the public, not the media, not the military, not the children. You swear allegiance to that group, and it's usually upon death, which pretty fucked up in itself if you think about it, right? You know, these are the people we look up to, and yet they actually despise you because they feel the need to belong to an elitist group, to feel good about themselves, to feel like they've got purpose, and you know, and these groups, and remember, I've been a part of them. I've been in the military, I've been in religion, because I was brought up in I think you'd call it Church of England. I don't really understand all that stuff. And yes, for people who are going to write to me, I have a relationship with Jesus, and I'm really happy about it. And I'm not going to explain it to you, because you will misunderstand not only how important it is to me, but also the context that I understand Jesus in, and it's actually on several levels. But so yeah, I've been in the military, which operates as a cult. I don't mean this disrespectfully. It does. When you get a group of people that become afraid to think for themselves because of what the others might think, that's just one aspect of being in a cult. There's a lot more, you know, the group think, this kind of thing. Religion, as I said, growing up, I actually worked for a cult, for an organization in Norway. This is the one that I went to do the volunteer work with around the world. And the people that controlled this organization had formed a cult, like an interior management faction of this organization that was actually a cult. It's listed in the world's 500 top cults or something, right? And it could get quite frightening when you were controlled. You know, the groupthink mentality that make you feel so guilty for thinking individually could be really quite frightening. Okay, then of course you've got to remember I worked for the Hong Kong Triads, again esoteric group, sworn to their own secrecy upon death. Very violent organization, you know. Life means nothing to these kind of people. It just really doesn't, right? And so I've sort of seen how that works. And it's like this. There's so many other factors than what the basic narrative presents us with. There's so many other factors. And of course, what do these factors do? They add to the chaos, don't they? Because it means you can never actually go, you know, why is the UFO alien, sorry if I don't use the right term, but why is it so fascinating? Well, it's because no one can actually really nail it down to a physical, I saw one, I've got a photo, I've got video of me with these grey, you know, it's, and that's not me saying it doesn't exist. Not at all. I don't have the right to say that, but what I have the right to say is, by fuck, sorry to keep swearing, but it adds to the chaos, doesn't it? Right. Some other things just that we can take into consideration that people, I just hope you find this interesting, is I get to talk to a lot of people on my podcast. I'm a people lover. I love these chats. I'm quite honored really that I'm starting to make a career out of chatting to wonderful people like you, James. You know, I have a lot of military people on, and without sounding rude or conceited, I can be talking to somebody that was very high up in the military compared to me. I was a lance corporal, right? I was the second to the lowest of the low. And yet I will go as far as saying I very rarely meet one of these high ups that really has a clue about life. They're generally quite indoctrinated. They generally really have a trouble stepping outside of the narrative that they've been sold. So, you know, and again, not a criticism. If I don't say this, I'm not doing people that are listening a justice. It means I'm lying to you, and I'm not a liar. So, you know, again, this is nothing personal. It's just, unless you are an enlightened individual, and there's certain things, I think I mentioned some of them in my beginning chat, that you need to do to become that, to free your mind and lift yourself onto the plane that you need to be on to see what is going on, right? And you're not going to get there, I'm afraid, unless you're very fortunate and lucky or something happens to you in your life. It's hard to get there when you've spent 25 years in a very rigid career where you're told what you think and what you believe, right? Why I'm chucking this in there, James, because a lot of these high ups in the military, they're not as clever as you think. This is why they join groups like the Masons. Is they you know, they suffer from ego problems. And listen, if you're listening and you're a Freemason, of which I know many Freemasons who don't know that I know they're Freemasons, right? All wonderful people, absolutely my friends, no issue, but they don't understand life on this level. They just know it down here. And when the devil operates, if we want to use it as a metaphor, that's all I will ever do. I don't think there's a guy with horns that lives in a red hot dungeon. And the same as I don't think there's a guy that sits on a cloud, you know, making people's dreams come true, or putting them into, you know, chucking them into hell or whatever. I'll use it purely metaphorically. But when you operate out of your ego for whatever it is, you are doing the devil's work. Other people might refer to it as, you know, draw a line across your middle. You've got your higher self, so your good thinking, you know, your empathy, your kindness, your generosity, consideration of others, gratitude for this life, moderating what you eat, moderating your drug and alcohol intake, because, you know, that's never going to be good, is it really? I mean, all these things, it's called higher self. And then you've got your animal or your lower self. That's your anger. Oh, he's got more YouTube subs than me. Oh, unsubscribe, you know, this is, oh, it's things like this. Oh, he said something in a comment that I don't like, so I will just write something horrible. But it's all the way the devil controls you, right? And devil, like I say, just a metaphor for is balance in the universe, right? And you need to find that balance, and you find it in your head. Is why I talk about it a lot, you know. but there's certain things you'll do which will block you from getting there. Anger, jealousy, greed, overeating, overindulgence. And it's not about like, I'm not trying to be the man in white here. This is not, I'm not morally lecturing you. If you want to go out and I don't know, go to McDonald's and eat everything on the menu, go and do it. I'm not going to stop you. I don't really care, to be honest. Only that, you know, I want you to have the best life possible. But if that's your thing, you live your life, I'll live mine. But I'm just saying, you do that, you know, you're probably going to be the same person that's Mr. Angry in the comment section, right? So, right. This is it. So, going back to the Mason thing, is nothing personal. Do I think that guys go to lodge on a Friday night and they, you know, they're doing their ceremonies and do I think that they believe that they're involved? No. And are they involved? Not really. Does it get a lot darker and deeper? Probably. But I'm just saying, whenever you do something out of ego, and esoteric organizations, cults, gangs is another one, they all operate by controlling your ego, and you need to see it. It's the same with religion. Sorry, I'm not talking about the scriptures here. That's not religion. That's wise men trying to give you a bit of a hint about how the universe works, and we know it's been corrupted over the years. We know that. I mean, that people that tell you if you go into this box every Sunday and you do certain things, you will be a good person. They are controlling your ego, and they haven't got a clue what they're talking about, right? So this is the thing, James, right? We've got all this stuff in play, and it all just adds to the chaos. And I'm fascinated about the whole UFO thing. Of course I am. I grew up with it, right? When I grew up, I was about 6, and our local newspaper ran this article, and it was about my friends, actually the guy that lived across the street from me, who was a teenager, and I was a kid, right? And him and his 3 mates had been walking back across the park one night, and the dog started barking. And when they looked up, there was a flying saucer hovering overhead. All the main, you know, whole page in the local newspaper, everything. They made it up, right? They just made it up. They thought, let's contact the local newspaper and tell them. I thought it was really brave. I would never have had the audacity to do such a thing, right? But I was explaining, wasn't I, about let me just talk a bit more about the military. So in the military, you've got a lot of very nice people. You know, I met some great people in the Marines. I really did. They're brothers to this day. I trust them with I do trust them with my life, because I let them look after my little boy, you know. Really nice people. But I'm trying to pick my words carefully, because I'm not out to offend anyone, but I am out to say, if we're not allowed to talk about these things, then life just becomes frightening. It just becomes not a place that I want to be. And what I will say is, you get some pretty rubbish human beings. You know, you get people that can get to like the grand old age of 40 or 45 and actually not be able to think for themselves. And the more you go through the rank structure, the more you're in that narrative. You can think really well in that narrative. You want to go to war and conduct an attack on, yeah, you are our guy. You are our guy. You do that really well. When it comes to think about, like, you know, who's sending us to that war and why, then it starts to become quite robotic and cliched in the answers. You hear things like weapons of mass destruction, brutal dictator. He did this to his own people. All the cliches that these sociopaths that control us, this global mafia, put out there through the media that they own, right? For the let's just say the gullible, of which I used to be. Remember, I was, you know, I was one of their foot soldiers. But, you know, they put out these little cliches because they know human beings will lap them up. We love sound bites. We love stuff that can come off our tongue, that we haven't had to think about, we haven't had to process, we don't understand, but we read it on page 3 of our, you know, tabloid newspaper, and it just sounds good in a conversation. Obviously, the big one, conspiracy theorist, right? Using that term used to be, it used to have some sort of effect. Now all it does is just highlight that the person using it can't think for themselves in any way, shape or form. Because to doubt that any conspiracy goes on in the world, especially at this moment in time when it's so blatantly obvious that our freedom is being stolen and that our children are going to end up in cages, whether that's the home cocoon or actual, you know, farms or you know what I'm trying to say, these institution with barbed wire around them and stuff. So what else can we say about the military? All right. Very often when I'm talking with people that haven't been in the military, but are really big into understanding the world and these kind of topics that we're talking about, James, they have this almost like mythical romantic notion that military is somehow like deep special ops. Not everybody, and I'm only saying this, I'm not accusing any particular person of this, I just hear this quite a lot. Oh, well, he was a Marine, so yeah, he's like CIA or MI5, or it's like, guys, honestly, all my time in the military, I never even saw an intelligence. The closest thing I got to intelligence was in the Northern Ireland conflict, where we had an intelligence officer, right? All that guy was the Marine that volunteered to be the intelligence officer. It wasn't like he went off to bloody, I don't know, MI5, CIA, NASA. Was nothing like that, right? Just a guy went, yeah, I'll do it. And he became our intelligent. And of course, he's liaising with the Northern Irish police, right? He's getting, you know, intelligence reports from them. But of course, it's going to be very limited. Just what we needed as a military unit to be able to go out on the ground in Northern Ireland and just do our job, right? Not going to be telling this guy who the top, you know, IRA players are, who they've been liaising with over in, let's say, Holland, where the weapons are coming in, you know, what the next big atrocity that's planned. Nothing like, it's just nothing like that. So as a military guy, you're never going to come into contact with that kind of level of intelligence operation. If you're special forces or special ops, I believe the Americans say, so your special boat service, SAS, your Navy SEALs, Delta Force, which I believe has changed names now. Yeah, of course you're going to get a higher access or liaison with intelligence. But again, it's going to be quite limited to the job you have to do. You're still essentially just a soldier that has to go and, you know, go on an operation. You're only ever going to know what you need to know to do that operation. And very few operators develop the mindset, the thinking, to step out of this military mindset and go, do you know what? I don't actually think what we're doing here is right. You know, very few. There's one chap in the UK called Ben Griffin. People might want to Google him, right? He was a Special Air Service trooper, and he was over there in the Middle East, and they used to go out on deployment every night, and they would work out of a base with the Yanks, so with the Americans. And he used to say, it's weird, we'd get this list of targets that we had to go and arrest, but like the Brits would come back and it's like, that guy was just a farmer. This guy, it turned out, no, this is the name of his brother-in-law. It's not even the right guy. This one was just just a guy, you know, no weapons, no, you know, we had no reason that we could arrest him and send him to, you know, Guantanamo or whatever it is. And it just went on. Basically, they went out every night. It was fairly academic. They'd come back. They never apprehend anyone. They certainly wouldn't engage anyone. He said, whereas the Americans would come back and say, yeah, man, we killed this guy and we just shot this guy. And he was like, this is wrong. This is wrong. Who are they shooting? Because all the people we get, it's just rubbish intelligence, you know? Or this guy, the reason he's on there is his brother-in-law doesn't like him. So he's gone to the British force, or he's gone to the security forces and gone, yeah, he's in an organ, you know, I'm trying not to say the key words, but he's in an organization. You want to go and get him. And it turns out, no, actually it's because his brother-in-law and him had an argument last week and he's reported him as being a key player or something, right? So anyway.
It's all cherry picked, Chris, where they just, they cook and they doctor the intelligence to suit a given agenda, right? And like, just to interject for a second, if you look at all these great allies of the U.S. that turned into boogeymen, Ho Chi Minh, whose life was saved by the OSS Deer Team in what we now call Vietnam, Indochina in World War II. The OSS Deer Team came there. They actually saved his life. He was deathly ill, and there was a medic there that nursed him back to health. His Declaration of Independence sounded almost word for word to the American Declaration of Independence. But, you know, then later on he morphs into a bad guy, Manuel Noriega, graduate of the School of the Americas, big-time drug trafficker. And one of the reasons why they took him out was he was taking too big of a cut of the drugs, right? He was taken down. Saddam Hussein was a CIA asset since '58. Osama bin Laden, the boogeyman, Osama bin Laden. As recently as the Balkans conflict, he was working with American privatized military contractors, MPRI in particular, to train the Muslims in the effort to dismantle and destroy and fragment Yugoslavia, which was once a beautiful unified country. And look what happened in the early stages of, the Americans always come up with these cliched code names for their operations, Operation Enduring Freedom. And I think it was in Tora Bora where they had hundreds of...
It again goes to the Satanism thing. Satanists, the evil
inversion,
always invert everything. So if
an
your operation is called Enduring Freedom,
when it's the opposite,
you know,
it's like they're enduring, like putting up with freedom for now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, and you're probably familiar with it. They had
it means the operation is permanent slavery, is what we're trying to say, right?
Exactly. And they had hundreds of so-called Al-Qaeda, but the Al-Qaeda, of course, was a catch-all term. Some of these were Chechens and Uzbeks. Some of them literally were trained by the CIA and trained by and worked with U.S. Advisors back in the day against the Soviets. And again, they morph into some bad guys. And so they had hundreds of them trapped there in Tora Bora. The Americans are stood down. Pakistani C-130 Hercs fly in and begin flying out the Al-Qaeda guys back to Pakistan. Of course, the Americans are pissed off. What happens? They begin talking about it. They go back to Fort Bragg. They start complaining. We had these guys surrounded. We could have finished them off. And then suddenly you start having a spate of murder-suicides. Those people, those Green Berets, so-called, I know that Royal Marines had Green Berets, but for a while, because of that novel in America, they call themselves, for a while, they called them Green Berets and U.S. Army Special Forces. Well, they were talking amongst themselves at Fort Bragg and other places. We had them on the ropes. They let them go. Suddenly, some of those guys started committing suicide. Suddenly, they started committing suicide, but like murder suicides, killing their wives, killing their families. That's how Black Ops works. And you look at what happened, like the Bo Grites was just one example. But if you look at some of the drug trafficking back in the day, Operation Watchtower was an infamous example of this. U.S. Special Forces out of Fort Devens on the East Coast, I think up in Washington, they got involved in a joint CIA and this other intelligence agency, let's say, of a Middle Eastern variety. I won't say their name, but it was a drug trafficking operation out of Colombia and Panama. And what happens, a lot of those Special Forces guys go back to America and they start getting bumped off. They start dying. One of them, William Tyree, was a corporal in Army Special Forces. He and his wife, who happened to be in criminal investigation division in the Army, were compiling a dossier of everything that they knew had happened, this drug trafficking operation, because they were tasked by their controllers to sneak into Colombia and plant these beacons that would allow the planes loaded down with cocaine and other drugs to land at Howard Air Force Base there in the Panama Canal Zone. Well, they framed William Tyree. If he's still alive, he's still rotting in a federal pen. And so when you point these things out, like you mentioned the Vietnam War, Averell Harriman was the State Department Far East desk guru, the same Averell Harriman, skull and bonesman, who it was his Brown Brothers Harriman bank, investment bank, and also the Union Bank, which financed the Germans, but the Brown Brothers Harriman Bank actually played a key role in revitalizing, re-jumpstarting, if you will, the oil industry in Russia. By then was the Soviet Union, because the Bolshevik Revolution, which was financed by Wall Street, financed by the City of London, had come in, and we're seeing the same thing today. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, the corporations are openly financing them. It's a communist insurrection, is what we're seeing.
Can I just chip in here, James, just to anchor a point down, is that what we can see from what we've both just said is that service personnel are incredibly fallible, right?
Yes. And I would like to add also something, just to interject with something too, because I see the dichotomy, the difference between American veterans, let's say, and British veterans. Like the books I've read about Afghanistan from British military vets, some of them are very outspoken. They're saying, oh, these Afghans, Hamid Karzai, I've seen them. They're a bunch of drug traffickers. Say it straight up. Whereas the Americans, I don't know if it's indoctrination, I don't know if it's brainwashing, or just, ego is a block to learning. We were talking about that earlier. Ego is a block to learning. And that's why in the cultural Marxism that's drummed into the students in America, they activate their egos. Don't listen to anyone over 40 years old. They don't even know how to operate a digital device. Your parents are stupid. They don't know what you know. So they activate their egos and they flood their supple minds with all this communist indoctrination, right? And so getting back to the point about the dichotomy that I see, whereas some, not all, but some of the British veterans of the military, I wouldn't say would have a cynical outlook, but they have at times a very realistic outlook of what's going on. If you read between the lines, they're saying a lot. Whereas when you read the books by Americans, well, except from besides the aforementioned Bo Gritz, who's got a great book called The Serve, and he lays out the whole drug trafficking thing, and a few others of, worthy of mention. But typically, what an American veteran writes, say about the Vietnam War, there's like regret about, oh, they didn't let us fight the war the way we could have. The politicians made us fight the war with one hand tied behind their back. It's like they hit this invisible ceiling where they can't see the hidden levers of power. Like the aforementioned Averell Harriman, whose Brown Brothers bank financed the Soviet Union and basically restarted the oil industry, right? He later on, he goes, follow the bouncing ball. He goes from financing the Soviet Union, then he becomes the guy who basically plays a key role in creating NATO. So the same guy and during World War II, Averell Harriman was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow and the Lend-Lease administrator too. So he goes from being a financier to the Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union. Then he helps set up NATO to defend Europe from the scary Bolsheviks. Decades down the track, he winds up in the Far East desk of the State Department, where one of his brilliant moves, and many mainstream historians don't see the significance of this. Averell Harriman played a key role in neutralizing Laos. He said, oh, we're going to make Laos neutral. Well, the Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese didn't adhere to the neutrality of Laos because they set up the Ho Chi Minh Trail and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's an example of these maneuvers. He was a skull and bonesman, like I said, these fraternal orders which you talked about. And just to cycle back to the point you made about the connection with ETs and UFOs, we're on a celestially driven timetable. The powers that be, the occulted knowledge, they know that our solar system is subject to cyclically celestially driven cyclical cataclysms. Every 9 to 12,000 years, the whole solar system goes through a reset, basically. And we're right on the cusp of that again. Some of you more astute viewers and listeners know that the sun rises, if you can see it through the chemtrail haze, the sun rises and sets in different parts of the sky now. Now, the Inuit Eskimos, in the Arctic Circle, they said straight up, the sun sets and rises in different places now than it used to be. So something has happened. Something has altered the rotational axis of the Earth's tilt. And I think, and one has to study the work of Dr. Thomas Van Flandern, I think his name was. He was a optical physicist at the U.S. Naval Observatory. And decades ago, he postulated that there was some very large astronomical body coming up from the southern skies, because whatever is coming up from the southern skies is having an effect on the orbits of some of the planets in our solar system, right? It's creating a downward tug on some of the planets. So Thomas Van Flandern went to New Zealand with an 8-inch telescope. This is like around 1980. To see if, down here, down under, so to speak, he could see this object coming up from the southern skies. Well, he goes back to America, and then within a matter of like weeks, he dies of cancer. Now, we know that Black Ops does have the ability to, infect people with fast-acting cancers. That's just one of their many potions. But the point of relevance is, if one goes onto the internet and onto YouTube. A lot of these have been, banished and censored by now. And there's a lot of disinformation sites. But I have seen, for lack of a better term, a second sun. I've seen it at 35,000 feet over Central Asia in a, British Airways flight. Because I was flying to the UK to take part in the first ever conference about reptilians, specifically about reptilians. I was one of the speakers there. So I'm huddled and, waiting to use a lavatory in the rear of the plane. I look out the window, and here's a big reddish ball top of this hemisphere poking above the perma-chemtrail haze, right? And there's the sun over there. Now, I'd seen the second sun on the ground on numerous occasions, and they're very clever. What they do is they chemtrail the part of the sky where they know this will be visible to obscure it, right? But I used to go to these surf cam websites here in Australia, and a couple of them, Fraser Island and Surfer's Paradise, used to get great captures of this second sun. But they took down that website, you see? So the point of relevance is, I believe that this second sun is in the solar system already. It's got its own debris trail. We're having more bolides, more meteorites, more talk of asteroids. So the point of relevance is, this second sun and its attendant mini solar system has the potential to create one of these celestially driven cataclysms again, and the powers that be know it. So they're pulling out all the stops to put everything in place so they have their dystopic, Orwellian kind of society with a radically reduced population. And I will say straight up that the genesis, the brains behind this is non-human, because you're asking about the connection. And I'll say what the connection is. These reptilian beings in particular, and this is found in all the ancient texts. I've just had on my show Pierre Sabak, who wrote brilliant books studying the etymology, the root of languages and the correspondences in different languages, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, et cetera, et cetera. And he's saying, and I have no reason to doubt him because he spent 15 years on this research. He said the ancient texts are chock full of accounts of vessels, of spaceships, of fleets, of craft, of aliens who are manipulating and guiding, malignly influencing human society through the power of hybridization. It goes back to what the Bible talks about, the Nephilim. They beheld the daughters of men, found them fair, and mated with them and begat children. And well, these children were hybrids. And that's why your average run-of-the-mill serial murderer, which to me is nothing more than a reptilian human hybrid, they lack the impulse control because they don't have a developed frontal lobe like we do, which is our impulse control net, right? And because they're a hybrid, these entities that work through them and take them up as hosts, essentially, can flood their mind with all this sadistic imagery, all this violent, sadistic, pornographic imagery. And if you read the accounts and the testimony of some of these serial killers, which I did, it didn't make for pleasant reading. I spent years reading accounts in their own words of what these serial killers say. And like, for example, the serial murderer Ted Bundy said scaly monsters used to come out of his closet when he was a boy, right? Now, we know in our field that wardrobes, closets, and this goes back to antiquity, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, et cetera, some of these beings they create portal entries, and they come out of literally wardrobes and closets and other places in the house. And here's this prolific serial killer, Ted Bundy, who was a reptilian hybrid, if there ever was one, saying that when he was a child, these scaly monsters would come out of his closet. And he's not the only serial killer who talks about interactions with incubus and succubus and monsters growing up, okay? So the point of relevance is through these fraternal orders, which are really just like the latest version of the astronomer priesthood, right? Which were hybridized between the gods, if you will. The gods were these marauding, manipulating ETs, and human beings, like a crossbreed. But because of their genetics and their neurology and their enhanced psychic ability, quite frankly, it's easier for these entities to work through them and give them all these ideas. See, I don't give them credit for being super intelligent. I think they're cunning, and the entities that work through them exist beyond time, beyond linear time, so they can see the beginning of the parade and the potential end of the parade, right? So these beings and the hybrid plantation managers here on Earth they work through, they think in terms of decades and centuries and millennia, whereas us, because they've foisted this monetized debt system upon us, most of us can only think, they can't even think beyond the next paycheck, right? And then on top of that, you create all these people, you compel them to be on the dole, right? So it makes them even more dependent. So the point of relevance is these fraternal orders of a lot of the shakers and the movers and the real players in the fraternal orders, Freemasons, the Templars, et cetera, a lot of them are just reptilian human hybrids. And that's why they have no empathy. They can sit there in their smoky gentlemen's clubs and just talk about depopulation and creating wars and all this other stuff because they lack empathy. But this has been an agenda going on.
Let's say two things. First off, for people listening to this, like, I'll get one life, right? This might be my only chance to talk to James in this lifetime. I hope it's the first of many times, but you know, and I just want to say I will talk about whatever I want to in my lifetime. And I say that because people are mistaking having conversations and discussing possibilities, theories, abstract concepts. Remember, my jury's always out. I can have this conversation. I'm not going to go away and think the world's controlled by this because I don't know. I don't know. Will I entertain it? And is it fascinating that these concepts seem to tie in everywhere around the world throughout history and almost bear like so much relevance in what we're seeing? I'm going to say it's in the media, so it's always a bit, you know, that's always a bit of a dodgy one, isn't it? But so that point, all I'm saying, guys, on that point is, don't mistake people having a conversation for people believing in that thing. I host a podcast. It's just a platform for people to come and talk. It doesn't necessarily represent my views. And I'm not saying this, I don't want anything from, if you want to unsubscribe from my channel, remember, you live your life, I live mine, then we're cool, aren't we? You don't want to unsubscribe? Great. Won't hold anything against you. But if we're blocking ourselves off to information just because we don't want to hear it because it doesn't fit our narrative, well, then we're kind of screwed, aren't we? Because we're never going to get any resolution. We can't, if you can't talk to me and I can't talk to you, how? My dad always said communication is everything. When communication stops, we're screwed, right? That was just one thing I wanted to say. The second thing, James, is can you explain to us whether it's a connection or a difference between this ET entity that I've been told can control human behavior and the reptilian thing that you said? I don't get, like, you're not the first person to say this to me, which is quite interesting in itself.